Hello. The Methodist Church has voted to redefine marriage and conduct same-sex marriage ceremonies in its churches. Yesterday, the National Methodist Conference, meeting in Birmingham, approved the change by 254 votes to 46. It also endorsed informal cohabitation, equating it to marriage. This was a journey which really began in earnest with the production of a document called God in Love Unites Us, which said that the church needed to change its understanding of marriage in order to extend it towards people of the same sex. One of the most important voices against this change in recent years has been the Revd Dr David Hull, the chair of Methodist Evangelicals Together. You may recall that in 2019, David was reported saying that he was saddened by the drift within the Methodist Church on same-sex marriage. Pressure as a result of that led to him stepping down from his position as chaplain at a Methodist school in Bath, which meant that he lost his income and his home. But I'm pleased to say that he subsequently became lead pastor of a free Methodist church plant in Bristol. David recently produced The Runaway Train, an urgent call to think again about God in Love Unites Us, and he joins me now. Thanks, David. Well, I suppose an obvious, if sad place to start is simply your reaction to yesterday's events. So marriage redefined, same-sex ceremonies, civil partnerships, cohabitation. The Methodist Church seems to have abandoned its 1993 resolutions affirming biblical marriage. In fact, it pretty much seems to have abandoned the Bible altogether when it comes to marriage and sexual ethics. Is that fair?
Well, Kieran, hello. It's good to see you. And yes, it is a very sad time for evangelicals within the Methodist Church. And yes, I think that is a fair summary. I do think that the Methodist Church has abandoned all of those things. This is the teaching of the Bible. It's the teaching that the Christian Church has held throughout the 2,000 years of its history. It's held by the majority of Christians around the world today. And that is what the Methodist Church has moved away from. And yet, there are thousands and thousands of Methodists who still believe that Jesus holds out a vision for life, deeply rooted in the Bible, that is better than anything else the world has ever known, better than anything else the world will ever know. And part of that vision is his teaching on marriage and relationships, marriage of one man, one woman for life, to the exclusion of all others. That really is for the good of society. You don't need to be a Christian to believe that. You don't need to be a person of any religious faith to believe that. Even scientific research tells us that children who are brought up by two biological parents who are married to each other, on the whole, do better against every measurable outcome than any other circumstance. Isn't that a wonderful thing? And that is what the Christian Church has believed throughout its history. It's what the Christian Church around the world still believes today. And yet the Methodist Church has moved away from it. There are many, many Methodists who still hold that vision for life that Jesus offers. And we will continue to do so. But it is a very sad day for the Methodist Church.
It was a clear vote. And you've alluded to this. But I mean, there were people speaking against it. I watched a lot of the debate. And it did show that there is still a sizable minority of Methodists within conference that were prepared to stand up for biblical truth. And presumably that's reflected in the country as a whole.
That's right. And we do praise God for those faithful people who spoke up for the teaching of the Bible, the teaching of Jesus himself within these debates. That can be a very costly thing to do. And they are representative of, as you say, a sizable minority of people across the whole Methodist Church. These proposals did have to go through a process of consultation across the whole country, and everywhere where these proposals were debated, there was a sizable minority of people who voted against them and voted for remaining faithful to the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of the Bible. And I believe that ordinary Methodists in the pew hold these views much more. So that sizable minority is even bigger than the votes might suggest. There are tens of thousands of Methodists who still believe the teaching of Jesus, that marriage is between one man, one woman for life, to the exclusion of all others. And we will continue to hold out this exciting vision to the world, the gospel of Jesus Christ himself.
There was what seem to me to be a number of quite extraordinary resolutions passed to say that actually marriage wasn't a doctrinal issue, and the church's doctrine wasn't actually being changed. Can you say something about that?
There is this really curious conversation going on about what is and what isn't doctrine and doctrinal changes within the Methodist Church, and it doesn't make sense to many of us. The argument is that the Methodist Church is not changing its doctrine, it's just changing its understanding of marriage and its practice of marriage. Now, to a certain extent, I understand what they say, because we are not changing the doctrinal standards, the formal statement of doctrinal belief that the Methodist Church holds. Actually, I don't think we would be able to change that, because we wouldn't get enough votes to change it, the required majority there. Those doctrinal standards aren't changed, but even the formal committees of the church themselves affirm that our doctrine as a church is partly shaped by our liturgy, the way that we worship. And one of the things that's happening that is required by these resolutions to change our understanding of marriage is to produce a second marriage service, to change our liturgy so that two men can be married to one another, or two women can be married to one another, and the language can be interchangeable. Now, we are changing our liturgy, we're changing the way that we worship, we're changing the way that we speak of God and faith and life. And so we are changing our doctrine. Methodist ministers, Methodist lay preachers every year have to affirm that they continue to uphold the doctrine and discipline of the Methodist Church. And there are many of us, and I'm one of them, who will not be able to affirm now that we do uphold the doctrine and discipline of the Methodist Church in the light of these changes. How can we, when the Methodist Church has abandoned the teaching of the Bible, the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of Christian tradition, the teaching of the majority of the Christian church around the world today? These are doctrinal changes indeed, and they cut to the heart of what we believe and how we live as a church.
I just pick you up on one of the things you talked about there in terms of the impact on ministers, whether ordained or lay. Will they be able to refuse to perform same-sex ceremonies? Will they be free to preach the biblical sexual ethic, to say that sex outside the marriage of one man and one woman is wrong? Will they be able to do that?
There are conscience clauses within the resolutions, which means that nobody will be forced to conduct same-sex marriages against their conscience. I think the question about preaching remains to be seen. The Methodist Church says that it affirms two understandings of marriage, the traditional understanding and the new understanding that it has just adopted. But there is increasing pressure already upon evangelical biblical preachers within the Methodist Church, at least to acknowledge that the Methodist Church believes two things. So the Methodist Church says that it will permit its preachers to continue to preach that marriage is between one man and one woman for life, but whether they will be required to add a caveat to say that other Methodists believe that marriage can be between two people, and other things that are unbiblical as the agenda progresses, that does remain to be seen. So these are very uncertain times ahead for the Methodist Church and for evangelicals within it.
Let me just ask you, you previously said that the agenda of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which shaped the proposals, that it was driven by a profoundly secular rather than a deeply and distinctively biblical and Christian vision. So looking back now on yesterday and the events coming up to that, would you stand by that assessment?
I stand by that statement, absolutely, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to do so. Not only has the agenda of equality, diversity and inclusion within the Methodist Church been shaped by a political vision, a vision of political pressure groups, started out with very honourable claims, and it has become misdirected. That is true not only of the EDI agenda within the Methodist Church now, but also the decisions of the Methodist Conference. It is a profoundly secular vision that is shaping these decisions, and we long to hold out the vision that was given to us by Jesus Christ himself As I say, the world knows no better vision than that, the vision for human life. And it is heartbreaking that the Methodist Church has moved away from it.
Okay, I said in the introduction that this has been a journey over the last couple of years. And over that time, I think it's fair to say there's been a high personal cost to you and to your family.
We always knew that there would be a price to pay for standing faithfully for the Lord. And we must say that there are many Christians around the world today who pay a much, much greater price for their faith. And what we have had to face in our family is nothing compared to those who are persecuted for the faith around the world. So I would much rather talk about the price that they're paying and their faithfulness rather than the things that we've had to face in our family. But there has been a price to pay, and perhaps it's worth just mentioning that because we won't be alone. And it is worth being aware of the cost of the decisions that other Methodists are having to face now. In 2019, when I responded to the conference votes then, provisionally passing these resolutions subject to consultation and then ratification, which has just happened, I made comments back then arguing for retaining the current teaching of the church. I was serving as a school chaplain at the time. Some of those comments were picked up and circulated around a school where I was serving. Now, it shouldn't have come as any surprise at all that a Methodist minister serving as a chaplain in a Methodist school upheld the current teaching of the Methodist Church. And yet, those comments seem to be very controversial. And I think it's a symptom of the spirit of the age in which we live. The reaction made my position untenable. And we had some very long discussions and complicated discussions. And in the end, I agreed to step down from that appointment. It was never my intention to bring those debates within the school at all, the politics of the Methodist Church for the hierarchy of the Methodist Church to resolve. But that was the cost. And of course, when a Methodist minister loses an appointment, you risk losing not only your base for ministry, but also your home, which is tied to your job, and your income too. And that affects the ministers' families. And there were some very, very difficult times for us as a family towards the end of 2019. But also, the Free Methodist Church reached out to us as Methodist Evangelicals Together and expressed their support for the stance that we were taking and wanted to stand with us and encourage us because they too believe that the vision that we present, given to us by Jesus himself, is the very, very best thing that the world could ever know. And they wanted to stand with us in that. And so when I did face difficulties, they came alongside us and they invited me to move to be pastor of a Free Methodist Church in Bristol. And I remain a Methodist minister in full connection with the Methodist Church at the moment, and I serve within the Free Methodist Church. So there is a cost to pay, and Methodists around the country will be counting the cost at the moment. But as we think about the cost that we have to pay, let's just remember and continue to pray for those who face a much, much greater cost day in and day out all around the world because of their faith in Jesus Christ.
And as you say, no doubt there'll be many others who will be having to contemplate the cost of whether they would remain within the Methodist Church or leave, and the impact that might have on their house and their income and so on. I'm sure there's others. Well, let me just ask you one more question, if I may, which is it might be a difficult question to answer, but what comes next for you and for other evangelicals within the Methodist Church?
It's a time of praying, reflecting, seeking the Lord, lamenting the position in which we currently are, and talking together as we discern the way forward. As I said, the words of Psalm 130 resonate deeply with us at the moment. Out of the deep have I cried unto thee, O Lord. But we are also filled with hope. These are, in many ways, very profound changes, momentous changes within the Methodist Church, and yet in a very real way, nothing has changed at all. Jesus Christ is still risen. He is still seated upon the throne. He still reigns supreme. He still has all authority in heaven and on earth. He is still being faithful to his promise to build the church. Nothing will ever prevail against that. He will still usher in a new kingdom, a new heaven, a new earth, a new creation. The earth will one day still be flooded with his glory. And that's the vision that we hold out. That's the vision that we strive towards. And as I read Psalm 130 these days, I'm reminded not only that it begins in the depths, but also that it encourages us to flee to the Lord and put our trust in him. That's what we're doing in these days. And I hope and pray that many evangelicals within the Methodist Church will, through the providence of God in some unexpected way, discover this very low moment will turn also out to be one of the very highest moments through the Lord's grace.
David Hull, thanks very much for your time.